for another perspective, is Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law School professor emeritus. He's author of a new book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump. Professor Dershowitz, always good to have you on. Thanks for being here. Let me start with, you had said that the deal that Mueller got from Manafort was a pretty good one as far as Mueller is concerned. Explain.
Well, I think both Manafort and President Trump acted too late. Manafort, if he was going to make a deal, should have made it before he was convicted. He would have gotten a better deal. And President Trump, if he was going to pardon, he should have pardoned before Manafort agreed to cooperate. So there's not going to be any pardon now. And Manafort has a deal. His sentence will reflect how much cooperation he gives. There is always the risk. You know, a man like Manafort has to walk a tightrope. If he's caught lying, the deal is off. On the other hand, he knows he gets a better deal if he can help support the narrative of the prosecutor. So we may see, and there's always the risk of that, and Judge Ellis said that in the first Manafort case, that some people like this not only sing, but they compose. That is, they elaborate a little bit, they remember things a little better than they occurred, and that's the risk to justice that could occur here.
Rudy Giuliani seems to think a couple things. Number one, he says, let me play a bite for you from him on Friday night, because he seems to think that this deal isn't as bad for them as others believe. Here it is.
I mean, the reality is there was a quote put out by a source close to Manafort that the plea agreement and the cooperation agreement has nothing to do with the Trump campaign. Quote, there is no evidence of collusion. Now, I know that because I've been privy to a lot of facts I can't repeat. But the reality is no evidence of collusion.
Now, Professor Dershowitz, even yesterday, Rudy Giuliani continued to say, according to sources close to Manafort's defense, that this cooperation agreement does not involve the Trump campaign. First of all, what is Rudy Giuliani referring to? Is this something he may have learned during the fact because they have a joint defense agreement of some sort?
No, the joint defense agreement, by the way, has to be over at this point if he's cooperating. Second of all, as Congressman Schiff correctly pointed out, you can't count on what was told to you while you had a joint defense agreement. Manafort is on your side. He says one thing. He's on the other side. He says something else. What I don't understand is how you can say that the deal is limited. The deal, as I understand it, says that Manafort will cooperate about anything that the special counsel asks him about. There are no limits. This wasn't a deal that says we're going to talk only about so-and-so, but we're not going to talk about the Trump or the Trump Tower meeting. Obviously, one of the first questions they're going to ask him is, did Donald Trump's son know about the subject of the meeting before it occurred, in order to put pressure on Trump Jr., in order to put pressure on President Trump. So, look, I understand why Rudy Giuliani, who's a good lawyer, wants to put this in the most positive light, but this was a very bad day for the Trump administration. It's bad because he doesn't know what Manafort is saying, and he can't count on Manafort saying only things that the special counsel already knows. And when you don't know what a cooperator is saying, then it's a bad day for you because you're vulnerable and exposed.
So you wouldn't put any stock, any assurances that maybe Paul Manafort himself gave to John Dowd or Rudy Giuliani or Manafort's defense team weeks ago or months ago. You wouldn't put any stock into any of the assurances they might have felt from the Manafort team before he cut this deal?
Well, I would use that information if he ever testified to cross-examine, because he would have waived the privilege at that point, the joint privilege. But no, I wouldn't believe anything he said. I would use the material that he told the Trump team while he was in a joint defense agreement to undercut his credibility if he then says something different. Is he lying now? Was he lying then? You can't believe him, that kind of argument.
Should the president be concerned that Paul Manafort may be able to say that a pardon was promised or a pardon was hinted at or the pardon was dangled during the joint defense agreement?
I doubt that. I think the president was pretty careful in what he said and how he said it, and what he said was said in public. So I don't think that's a real concern. I think the concern is putting together information that the prosecutor knows about but can't connect. We have to remember again that collusion is not a crime. Conspiracy is a crime, but conspiracy requires knowledge. And it's also possible that Manafort was always acting on his own to make more money.
Yeah.
He was using the Trump campaign, saying, I'll make introductions, I'll help you, but that the Trump campaign didn't really know about this. That's a likely explanation beyond the series of, quote, coincidences.
Do you believe the president has the legal team he needs to take on Robert Mueller? It seems like Robert Mueller has yet to lose.
Well, prosecutors have a tremendous advantage. As Congressman Schiff correctly points out, you don't mess with prosecutors. They'll come after you. They'll make you plead guilty. They'll threaten your family. President Trump had a point when he said civil libertarians like me have been concerned about flip witnesses for many, many, many years. Prosecutors have too much power to flip witnesses and to use their testimony. So, of course, there has to be concern. Prosecutors have all that much power, and all defense attorneys realize that.
Right, but do you believe the president has the best defense team he needs right now?
You know, I never want to comment on other people's defense teams. Everybody would do it differently. Rudy Giuliani, I've known him for 30 years. I've been against him. I've been on the same side. He's an extraordinarily talented and able guy. Jay Sokoloff is a brilliant, brilliant lawyer. I'm sure before this case is over, other lawyers will be added to the team. I will not be among them, but there will be other lawyers. And teams tend to grow and shrink when you have a complicated case like this. Okay. But they're up against a very, very difficult problem. When you have a prosecutor who can give immunity, can give deals, can make deals, it's very, very difficult.
Professor Dershowitz, as always, sir, thank you for coming on and sharing your views.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.